in various forms over the last several years, including starting by teaching a course at Concordia in the finance department of the John Molson School of Business here in Montreal. This has been going on, I guess, 7 or 8 years at this point, way before most people in business schools were really looking at ESG from any perspective other than management or strategy, not so much through the investment lens. We've also been offering a course at the Executive Center at JMSB for over 10 years now on sustainable investing as well. It's a non-credit course, certification really. More recently, as this topic of sustainability became more central to investment and business, I also started getting involved in running a student, or managing a group of students that are running a student-led fund with a mandate, with a sustainability mandate, and we do this in partnership with Manulife, the Canadian insurance company, the investment arm, of course, of Manulife. And then also I'm responsible for what we call the sustainability ecosystem, which is kind of a broad organization within Concordia, whose mandate is to do things exactly as what your group is doing, what ESG McGill is doing, disseminating knowledge and spreading knowledge on sustainability broadly. And so we bring in expert groups, expert speakers. We bring in, we do learning labs, debate series. We create content. We earlier this year worked with Senator Rosa Galvez to help her write a white paper and promote her bill, which is called CAFA, Climate Aligned Finance Act, in order to try to align the financial system with Canada's climate policies. So it's just a quick overview of what I do.
Yeah, Michelle, if you'd like to sort of introduce yourself as well, that'd be amazing.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me this evening. So I guess my involvement in sustainability goes back quite a long time, I guess into the 1990s when I first got involved in sustainability through work for government and for NGOs. Before around 2008, I joined a firm called NEI Investments, which was through its predecessor organizations was essentially the first firm in responsible investment in Canada that opened the first fund, an ethical fund back in 1986, and was really a kind of pioneer in that space. And I worked there for 10 years in the environmental, social and governance team, ran the corporate engagement program of stewardship with our investee companies. Then in 2019, I left NEI because with a group of like-minded people who were also working in ESG at Canadian investment firms, we felt there was really a kind of a need for an advisory company, consultancy that could really try to bridge the gap between what we were seeing in the expectations of investors regarding ESG and corporate practice on sustainability. So we opened up that firm in 2019, and we have grown considerably since then. Our practice covers my own sort of day-to-day practice, which is the investor practice, where we're working with institutional investors to develop their responsible investment policies and practices and reporting and alignment with emerging responsible investment standards. And then we also have a corporate practice where we're working with companies to develop their ESG strategy and their disclosure on environmental, social and governance issues. I'm very pleased to be with you this evening.
Thanks so much for joining us. Chris, if you'd like to also sort of give us a little bit of background about your prior experience working in the ESG field, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, great. My name is Chris Vangerven. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel, and really excited to be kind of standing alongside two real experts in the ESG field who have a pretty strong wealth of experience. I have been working in ESG for a while, but nowhere near as long as some of these participants have on the panel. So my real start with ESG was during my biology undergraduate course. And throughout that program, researchers the research that we did kept calling for further research to understand exactly what was going to happen. And I was getting frustrated because at some point you have to find solutions. You know the problem is there. You don't have to know to 99% accuracy what the problem's going to be. And was also frustrated seeing that ecosystem services and things like biodiversity were not valued anywhere nearly as effectively as they should be. So I wrote my undergrad thesis on how to monetarily value ecosystem services, a little bit of a contradictory and slightly risky place to write something, but then transitioned into doing a environmental economics and business masters, where I learned a little bit more about what sustainability looks like at a corporate level. But again, still a little bit interested more in that biodiversity and nature side. So wrote my thesis then on the differences between how to manage nature-related financial risks and climate-related financial risks. And throughout that process, realized that the level of disclosure in the US when it comes to these corporates is nowhere near high enough to really start to make some of these comparisons and decisions that need to be made towards reaching some of these longer term goals. So after that, transitioned into starting the ESG research program at an equity research company in London, looking at US listed stocks and writing some of the ESG research that they were working on. And finally now working at Nasdaq in a somewhat similar role to Michelle, where I'm advising corporations on ESG from a investor, stakeholder, rating agency stakeholder, frameworks, and internal stakeholder perspective to help them really understand all the different perspectives that they need to take into consideration when it comes to standing up an ESG program.
Perfect. That was a really, really thorough introduction from all of you guys. Really appreciate that, giving us a little bit of background. I guess firstly, just to kind of start off with some questions. So this one's more aimed at Michelle, but I'm sure all three of you guys could probably chime in or something on this. But sort of starting back like in 1986 with that initial ethical fund that you had, like basically we were just wondering like what has changed, what ESG principles have changed and developed over time from corporations' perspectives and over the years.
So I think, well, fortunately, I wasn't there in 1986.
Okay.
That would be really scary. But if I look back to 2008, when I got into responsible investment, I would say what's changed is, to be honest, in 2008, what made you a responsible investor was saying that you were a responsible investor. Basically, there weren't really any standards. If you worked at a firm that was a bit of a pioneer in the space, what you did was leading practice kind of by default, because it was very much a niche activity. And I think if I would say what has changed since then is only a couple of things. Responsible investment and ESG for the corporates has become very mainstream and pretty much an expectation. In fact, if you're an investment manager these days, it's actually quite difficult to compete for a mandate if you haven't got some kind of an ability to articulate a responsible investment approach. A lot of standards have developed since in the last kind of 10 or 15 years, both in responsible investment and corporate ESG. So it's a bit more challenging to get started now because there are actually expectations for what you're doing should look like. And I would say the other thing is that what started as a kind of values-based focus on ethical investing became dominated by a kind of value-based ESG integration approach that focuses on financially material ESG issues for investors and for companies. But what we're seeing now is actually a surging interest in measuring kind of real-world sustainability outcomes alongside value focus. So it's kind of a little bit back to the future, but a slightly different angle than that original ethical investing angle. I guess I would now call it a sort of sustainability outcomes angle, coming to the fore alongside that interest in the financial impacts of ESG issues.
Yeah, I can jump in here if you'd like as well to comment. I mean, first of all, Michelle, I think you probably worked with the legendary Bob Walker at NEI.
Certainly did.
what many of us consider really a pioneer, and he certainly is. NEI was one of the definitely the pioneers, and Bob Walker was central to all that. I completely agree with what Michelle said. We've seen an evolution from negative screening, from avoiding sin stocks, towards more sophisticated integration of sustainability factors. And even more recently, we've seen a move away from the simplistic approach of ratings and just a score-based, high-level single number. You cannot simplify sustainability issues into a single ranking or rating or score or what have you, or whatever. I think that's where the industry is heading right now. Another change I think we're seeing is the pressures coming from the allocators, the asset owners, those that have long-term investment horizons, and therefore investment managers today, essentially, if they want to do business and continue to do business, have no choice but to develop not only sustainability or ESG related products or policies, but credible ones, right? Because greenwashing has as the topic of today's talk is, states, has become central to all these issues. And of course, the last thing I would say is that we've seen an increasing focus on climate, as we've seen climate change, the physical impacts of climate change manifest themselves, as well as the transition aspects in terms of carbon pricing, in terms of increased regulations, especially in Europe, and so on, become more evident for investors.
So kind of speaking to the move, Michelle mentioned kind of the move to standards, and I guess thereafter with the issues, kind of simplifying them to whether that be a simple score or not. One thing that comes to mind with me is kind of like, as highly publicized SEC investigations and more pressure comes from the top down around misleading ESG claims are kind of making the headlines and dominating the news. Do you anticipate these crackdowns as kind of a form of pressure, and reputational, financial, and legal risks will actually be able to be enough to change behaviors? Or are there alternative solutions that you think are needed to actually be able to enforce this change?
Yeah, I can take this one. So just to maybe start with a little bit of a definition, when I run through what I'm going to talk about, the investor, consumer, and company are going to be the three terms that I'm kind of going to be referring to. So here, the consumer would be someone like yourself. A company would be something like H&M, and then the investor would be something like Goldman Sachs, just to provide some clarity on the relationships I'll be talking about. So I'll answer this question specifically from the investor kind of viewpoint, and why the impacts of investor greenwashing are so important. So kind of similar to what Sasha was just talking about, I'm sure many people on this call have seen several headline level investigations and fines against large investors like BNY Mellon and Goldman Sachs over the last few months, due to their misleading ESG fund labeling. So just to provide a little bit better clarification on what is happening with fund classification and what this really means in the US from their ESG investing standpoint. So I'm aware that Amr and Michelle were talking about how the level of ESG funding and the inputs that they're looking at are starting to become significantly more complex. So not just looking at rating agencies or kind of thematic investing or screening investing, but when you look at that from a global standpoint, a lot more of that is happening in Europe. And when you look at the US, integration funds are making up the largest proportion of ESG investing at this point in time. So what does that mean? So ESG integration funds are funds that mention they look at ESG information as part of their investment process, but this cannot come above normal fundamentals research. And I mentioned in Europe, we're moving a little bit away from this. There is regulation already in place in the EU and Australia as well, pushing back against the use of ESG in the fund name of these integration funds. But in the US, you are still allowed to name an integration fund an ESG fund. There is some potential regulation and proposals from the SEC, but why this is important is this can be misleading to consumers and companies. So consumers looking to really drive forward some sort of ESG program may think, okay, this is an ESG fund. If I invest in this, this will drive something very positive. However, these funds may really just be looking at fundamentals and ESG just being some sort of minor component of their overall research. And then also when it comes to that company level, when companies are trying to understand from a multi-stakeholder perspective, what ESG programs they should really be disclosing. I'm sure Michelle has had similar problems with this as well, is when you're trying to drive forward what an investor wants from you, and the investors aren't really being clear on what they're actually looking for and how they're labeling their own funds, it becomes quite difficult to explain to a company, okay, you need to focus on climate change. You need to focus on diversity, equity, inclusion based on the industry that they're in. So I do think that with the level of negative press that's coming towards these programs, and also some of that SEC guidance potentially coming in towards relabeling this, I think investors are starting to be a little bit more wary of making some of these exaggerated ESG claims. There is a head of responsible investment that I'm very close to at a large private asset manager in Europe, and a few of the kind of her team members and other companies that she's spoken to have actually started degrading some of their funds because they're wary of thinking that the new ESG regulation is too far advanced of what they can do at this point in time. So even if they are working towards an ESG program, they don't think it's strong enough to be hit with some of these regulatory things, and are really nervous of being slammed with a headline aspect title like BNY Mellon and Goldman Sachs have.
Amr and Michelle, is there anything that you got on the same page?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think actually I think that's a good thing, right? You know, if you look at there's a report that used to come out every 2 years. Now it's going to come out every year from the Responsible Investment Association of Canada, and in combination with similar organizations, you know, in the US and Europe, Australia, Japan, etc. So the last version of the report, the global version of the report, the last one I saw came out 2020. And of course, pandemic put a bit of a stop or / delay to all of that, as with many other things. But it was interesting because that report showed a decline in assets under management in Europe, not so much in the US or Canada. And that to me was really informative, because in Europe, the decline was not actually in total AUM. It was more a decline as a result of those higher standards being applied, as Chris mentioned, right? So when you look at reduction of assets in Europe that are classified as responsible, it's only because the definition has become more strict. The same thing happened in Canada with the report that just came out actually last week, publicly released RIA report, showing that assets in Canada have also slightly declined from the last time they published a report. Again, as a result of stricter definition, more reliable classification of what really is a sustainable fund and what is not. I think that the fact that regulators are cracking down, Chris mentioned the fines in the US. Similar thing is happening in Europe, with Deutsche Bank having actually been raided by investigators, and there's a criminal investigation, not just fines taking place. The Canadian Securities Administrators, which is the umbrella group of regulators, provincial regulators here in Canada, has also last year came out with some pretty strict guidance as well on what funds can and cannot do, and what they may or may not say should they claim to be selling sustainable funds. So I think that's good for Michelle's former employer, as NEI, is one of the most credible funds out there. Not so good for those that are doing kind of a Google search copy paste, put it into a prospectus, and let's jack up the fees and say we're selling ESG. So I think it's just part of the growing process.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that the regulatory factor is really important. I agree with him. It's you can correlate those the emergence of those regulations to that sudden drops in the sort of responsible investment assets, as people were suddenly confronted with needing to meet a standard. As Chris also mentioned, exactly the European regulation, rather complex sustainable finance disclosure regulation, which is still being rolled out piece by piece. As that regulation pieces roll out and it becomes clearer what the expectation is at each level, we're seeing people kind of jumping backwards and forwards in and out of the more challenging categories, that with the realization that they don't quite maybe their fund doesn't make the grade. And I do think that's a good thing. I think what a lot of these regulations do is make you disclose the content of your fund. I think we can think of them a little bit like the ingredients on the on a food package. They tell you what the responsible investment constituents are that are within the fund, and set some standards about what it's going to take for you to say that your fund has this or that aspect of responsible investment contained in it. I'm not so keen on the idea of regulations that actually define that, you know, for a fund to be considered responsible investment, it must contain all of the following ingredients. What will worry me about that is it might kind of stifle innovation in terms of people coming up with completely new ideas in responsible investment. I don't think we want that to happen, but it's really important, like a really important, I think, problem that is sometimes thought to be greenwashing but maybe isn't, is that end investors, they think that a product does something. They think it's fossil fuel free or something like that, but that isn't actually the objective of the fund. They've misunderstood it or been missold it, and it's not the thing that they wanted. If we can get to a stage where there is very clear labeling of the products in terms of what's in them, and people who are buying products actually understand what those labels mean, that hopefully that will address at least the misunderstanding part of what we might think is greenwashing, so that then we can really attack the bit that's genuinely people misleading other people.
I guess just to kind of bounce off some ideas with Chris and Amr here. What do you guys think about having some sort of, I know Michelle said like it's kind of hard to really define a fund or really like have strict definitions on ESG standards because of the stifling to innovation. And I was sort of wondering what you guys thought about that, like, because I feel like there's two sides to the argument sort of thing, because if you overly define it as well, like I feel like there's a lot of opportunities for maybe like loopholes as well for different funds, like ticking off all these boxes, but like the regulatory framework might have missed a few things and it will lag behind and stuff like that. So I was kind of just wondering what you guys thought on like where to draw the line sort of in the sand on what's considered like an ESG friendly fund or not, or if it should just be more of a voluntary disclosure type of thing in this sort of space.
I'll go first. I'm trying to think where to start, because this opens up a whole Pandora's box of things going through my head. Taxonomy, Article 8 and Article 9 in the EU, and all kinds of issues. There's so many ways to tackle this. So I'll list a couple. In the EU they have a couple of different classifications. Article 9 funds meet the highest standard of what is sustainable and what is not. Article 8 is a bit less. Article 6 is not sustainable, or not claiming to be, at least. Taxonomy is really, I guess, an important definition. It's like a dictionary, right? It kind of defines, okay, what is a sustainable economic activity and what is not. But it's also controversial because it depends on whose perspective you're looking from, right? For Europeans, any company within the oil sector in Canada is untouchable and is irredeemable, and can never become quote unquote sustainable, right? Whereas the way a lot of people view it here is that, well, those are industries that today are carbon intensive, but why should they not be given a chance to map out a credible decarbonization pathway, and be given some sort of temporary transition to classification that, yeah, you're not, you're brown today, but you have a path toward to be green in the future. So in that sense, it's a very complex area. I do agree with the lighter touch, right? That you shouldn't really be prescribing what is sustainable and what is not. But I think we do need some standards to create a structure, right? So that we also raise the bar and avoid this greenwashing issue. And I think what's really going to help towards all of this is the rollout of the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB disclosure standards, which are in the process of now being rolled out, and hopefully they will be adopted at least as a baseline by regulators across the world.
Yeah, there's something I want to add to that. Amr raised a really interesting point about not blacklisting companies just based on the current industry that they're in. So a really, really strong example of this, I don't know how many of you are aware of the company Ørsted, but they used to be called DONG, which was Danish Oil and Natural Gas, and their investors and stakeholders and board members all helped push the company to gradually be pretty much 100% renewable company at this point in time. So they were given the opportunity, the investors gave them clarity on what they were looking for. So I guess my point of view here is maybe not to have too much regulation on how to label certain funds, but for the funds to actually be required to disclose what the aim is of that fund. So whether the aim is to really transition it towards being renewable, whether they're looking towards diversity, equity, and inclusion, just giving a bit more detail about what they're looking towards. And then it means that Michelle and myself, when we're advising companies on what the investor viewpoints are, we can actually explain to them, look, these are your top investors. This is what they're looking for. This is what you should start doing. At this point in time, the best examples that we have for getting this level of information is looking at the stewardship policies of that in larger investment firms. So for example, Goldman Sachs has a wide investment stewardship policy, which lists the general themes that the overall company is looking towards when they're kind of managing their investments. But when you actually break that down to a fund level, it can be a little bit kind of unclear. One of my connections works at a very large investment bank where the kind of main thing that they mention in their stewardship policies that they don't look towards investing in companies which are family owned, and yet he runs a fund at that company only looking at family owned businesses. How does that make sense? So unless you're really explaining when the company is looking at their underlying fund holdings and they can understand, okay, I'm being held by these funds, this is what they care about, this is what I should start doing.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Christopher. In the meantime, sort of with respect to time for everybody here and their speakers as well, as promised, I think this would be a great opportunity to open up the questions to the audience at large. So if anybody would like to unmute themselves and go ahead and ask a question for any of our speakers, I highly recommend you do that now and take advantage of this opportunity.
Yeah, go ahead, Hannah.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, it's more of a general question, but I'm just curious to hear what everyone has to say. What surprised you most about the industry or working in ESG in different industries? It's kind of open to your interpretation, but I always think it's an interesting question to ask.
Yeah, I can start with that one. So I would say what surprised me most moving into at least a US-based ESG advisory role is when you look at the public disclosures of kind of a lot of these companies, their ESG programs look to be non-existent. They may not have any ESG reporting. In their proxy, they're really not putting anything out there. And then in their 10K, it's not really much beyond levels of compliance they need to hit for human capital management. But during our advisory process, when we start to engage more with the companies and learn more about what they're doing, you can really realize that they don't understand what ESG actually means yet. So, like, for example, one of my companies is a very small regional bank, $150 million market cap. But when we ran through the interviews and learned more about what they're doing compared to the metrics that the rating agencies, frameworks, and investors were looking towards, they were hitting 97% of the metrics internally. They just weren't disclosing any of it because they didn't know it counted for ESG. And they also didn't know what programs they had internally because it was also siloed. So I guess not taking too much of an aggressive judgment towards a company that may not have much disclosed yet from an ESG standpoint is what I think took me some time to unlearn. Coming from a European kind of perspective, the whole time of education there, I was thinking, wow, the US know nothing, what are they doing? But then when you get here, it's no, they actually are doing a lot. They just aren't 100% clear on what they need to be disclosing.
If I can jump in there, I would say one of the things that, I don't know if it's surprising to me or if it's, I think it's needs fixing, is that, okay, I think having been in sustainability a while, I think that we made a bit of a wrong turning back in the early thousands by focusing, everybody was focusing on metrics. A lot of people were starting their ESG, or it wasn't called ESG then, sustainability journey, based on metrics, which is really, I do think, is the wrong end. It's kind of the wrong end of the horse. What I spend a lot of time trying to talk to people about these days is how you can have a very serious and disciplined and strategic approach to ESG, and how do you do that, which I do think starts with really things like doing a materiality assessment to work out what are your most critical ESG factors, thinking about how they integrate into your governance and your strategy and your risk management, and then thinking about what metrics are out there that would allow you to measure performance, what might be available in kind of standard frameworks that you could use so that you can produce information that's comparable. Are you going to set targets? And ultimately, are you going to assure any data that you do decide you're going to disclose and bring to it the same kind of discipline that you might apply to your financial information? And I do think we're increasingly seeing people taking a strategic approach, which is really great, starting at the right end by really thinking about what ESG issues are most important for their entity. Because if you take it from that end, it's much easier to get ESG onto the top of the agenda at a company if you can show that the factors are really, really material, to get the board interested, to get the senior management interested, to get the whole executive team on board. And if you can do that, then you've broken out of your little sustainability silo, and you're likely to get a kind of ongoing support for moving your company forward on ESG and sustainability issues in a way that's different if it's kind of just emerged as a sort of marketing endeavor, or based on this feeling, or we've got to get some kind of report out there. I don't think that's the right end to start at when you're tackling ESG.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's really interesting. And I think it is important to acknowledge that you can integrate strategy into ESG without going as far as greenwashing. And I think it's important to acknowledge that strategic side of everything. So yeah, that was really interesting.
Thanks for the
I don't
question.
know if Amr had something else, or if we want to
Sure,
move on
if
to
you want me
another
to
question.
quickly,
go ahead.
I can jump in quickly, sure. I think the one thing I would say that probably surprised me the most, in a good way, is that during COVID, a lot of people were expecting that sustainable investing would take a back seat to immediate existential issues, but it turns out that resiliency became the word of the year in 2020, and guess what? Sustainable funds are resilient by definition, right? Because they seek to adapt to the world, to a changing world, and that's exactly what COVID forced on us. So investors recognized that, and we actually saw a massive increase in capital flows towards sustainable funds in 2020.
Great. I just wanted to, I saw that Cameron had posted a question in the chat, then I'll get to Aslan and Annalise's questions after. And sort of what Cameron had asked here is that, are there any political hurdles that stand in the way of corporations achieving ESG ambitions? And sort of just to add my own sort of thing to that, I was also wondering in particular, just sort of the large influence that like multinational companies have on governments and like their lobbying power, and how that might be impacting like good-hearted ESG ambitions.
I mean, maybe I can quickly tackle just the political side of it.
Yeah, just the political hurdles, I guess.
Yeah, I'll do that, and then I'll let the other panelists think about how to answer the second half, which thankfully is too complicated for me to answer at this point. So I'll let them take it. So when it comes to some of these political hurdles, it's really interesting when we're advising our companies and our clients on things like the SEC ruling. So whether they should start really tracking their climate emissions, by what time they need to do this, whether they need to set climate targets. And it's very surprising for me to see corporations really are just 100% wanting to align with that, not so much with what everyone else is kind of doing in the market. They're like, okay, let us know exactly when the next SEC kind of update comes, and then we'll know exactly what we need to work towards aligning towards this. And if rulings like this don't come in and the political parties at hand aren't really pushing these forward, it becomes quite complicated to really drive some of these large changes that need to happen over a longer course of time. And I guess the biggest difference you can see this between is if you look at the EU versus the US, you can really see that the politics there has driven forward a significant kind of difference in ESG fund labeling, climate targets, EU taxonomy, even looking at things like biodiversity, which are not really talked about yet at a US level.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of pick up on that. I mean, the one thing that I think is very interesting about the European regulations is that it might look like they only impact EU investors, but this is far from being the case. The way that they are framed up means that so if you like, investment management is an incredibly global industry. People all over the world are working for other investors all over the rest of the world. The implication of the SFDR European regulation is that if you are an asset manager who is working for a European investor who falls under the regulation, you're going to need to help them to meet the terms of the regulation. They're going to need information about the piece of the fund that you are managing for them. They need you to provide them with information that's going to allow them to do their disclosures. And then there is this piece within SFDR, the principal adverse impact disclosures, which are comply or explain for some investors, but actually comply for some other investors in Europe. They've just got to do them at a certain point. That's a list of indicators relating to environmental, social, and governance impacts of companies. They're supposed to collect for the entire portfolio. That implies that they somehow have got to get this information on sort of the climate impacts and human rights impacts and so on of the underlying investee companies for their portfolios for the whole world. This implies a need to gather that information about companies all around the world, regardless of whether they're in Europe or wherever they are. So some of these new regulations could have some quite significant impacts worldwide, way beyond the localities and jurisdictions in which the regulations have been promulgated. And I don't think, like, a lot of corporates and investors still haven't quite grasped the implications of SFDR for them sitting in their other parts of the world. And I think we're going to see that with other kind of responsible investment labeling regulations that come out over the course of time. They're going to have an impact way beyond the markets in which they were promulgated.
Perfect. Amr, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything else. If not, I'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, we can move on to the next question.
Perfect. Aslan, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can go ahead now.
Yeah, for sure. I've just got a quick question. Just curious, how do you kind of instill accountability within these larger corporations when they're incentivized, as well as their subsequent shareholders are incentivized just by the mere vague commitments that they're making to kind of go carbon neutral and or making these ESG commitments?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There isn't a single way. There are a combination of ways that you can hold them accountable. One is to look at their executive compensation. If they are sincere about working towards any sort of decarbonization or sustainability goals they've set for themselves, unless you tie that to the compensation, especially of senior executives, then it's probably they're not that serious, right? Unless they do that, and of course scrutiny, right? So scrutiny from investors, from media, from NGOs. makes it, becomes a reputational issue as well. And one other area you can look at, of course, is what happens behind the scenes, right? Because there's a PR aspect to it, right? And then there's a quiet lobbying aspect that sometimes happens against some of what the public statements are. So I think that's one way to look at it. And also, where does ESG responsibility reside within the corporation, right? Is it a core strategic imperative, or is it the responsibility of the marketing and PR and investor relation people that just sort of, essentially ultimately leads to greenwashing?
I'm not sure if anybody else.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sorry, speaking over each other. Amr, on that note, I'm really curious. Do you have any good examples of the highlighted companies that have done well tying their executive compensation to their decarbonization commitments?
I guess off the top of my head, I can think of one that has done that very publicly, which is BP, energy company, one of the major oil and gas conglomerates in Europe. So BP has been very public about that, and they've set pretty ambitious decarbonization goals, including that they expect to extract 40% less oil and gas by 2030 than they did in 2020, which is a very explicit and very ambitious target. And of course, they intend to replace that with all kinds of ventures into more renewable energy and low carbon type of businesses. But yeah, that's sort of the one company that comes to mind.
And following back off that, do you think by tying this back and forth with their compensation, do you think that'll lead to more feasible and achievable campaign or goals that they're setting forth?
One would think that it would. I guess time will tell, right? But if you are tying it to compensation, then it kind of automatically means you have to set realistic targets. And at the same time, if you're not setting targets that are ambitious enough, then you're going to come under pressure. We've seen European companies get sued for this. We've seen Shell get sued, held accountable by the Dutch central bank, the Dutch Supreme Court, for inadequate climate targets. So I would think that this is, yes, the most effective way to lead to companies actually setting achievable targets while under pressure to set targets that actually move the needle and don't just make a change on the margins.
Thank you for that. Michelle, Chris, would you like to add anything else on that question?
I mean, maybe only that it's the profit motive and sustainability aren't necessarily incompatible, and they're quite often mixed up together. I mean, if you take say there's a firm, it's a real firm that makes its money from drone-based inspection of wind turbines. That firm's supporting the efficiency of the energy transition. It's also reducing the need for workers to go up into a very, very hazardous environment up those towers. That has obviously a big health and safety impact. But it's also trying to make the biggest possible profit out of doing that. And if you're a for-profit industry, you can't ignore the need to make a profit. I mean, you can get sued if you ignore the need to make a profit. That's the reality. I just go back to the same thing. I think ESG gets the most consistent corporate attention and support when it's been closely tied into the firm's strategy and the financial risk and opportunity of ESG for the firm has been revealed. Then it will always get attention.
Thanks, Rochelle. And Elise, I guess this is your opportunity to ask a question now.
Yeah, thank you, Sasha. So my question kind of centers around more so, I guess, the meaning of interdisciplinary in relation to sustainability and ESG. So I know that, Chris, you'd mentioned earlier that you had more of a background in biology, and that sort of frustration with lack of action regarding the precautionary principles sort of what led you into the ESG realm. But I was wondering, have you had any experiences that really showed the benefit of having a different background in this field? And if Michelle and Amar, you have some other experiences you want to share as well, but I just I found it interesting that you kind of made that switch. So I was wondering if there's any positives that have come out of an interdisciplinary background, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give some slightly easier ones, and then maybe a little bit more complex of how it's actually impacted maybe longer term career. But when I was applying for my sustainability masters, they had accepted 99% of applicants. They had left one spot open for someone who didn't do economics because they wanted someone who had come from a different background. So when I applied, I got accepted within 24 hours, just because they had been looking for someone with a biology background to actually maybe counter some of the discussions that economists have always had when it comes to looking at these things like externalities. Because unless you're looking at that wider stakeholder perspective of how these problems are being solved, and you only have economists looking at it over and over again, they're going to end up with the same results they've had over and over again, which clearly aren't working. And then from a more career perspective, it's really interesting to always have some sort of thing that's driving you forward. So for me, I really care about building out something related to biodiversity. And this has allowed me to go to a multitude of conferences that are happening at this point in time from a biodiversity standpoint and speaking to these topics, just because there aren't yet that many experts in the field looking at nature-related financial risks, how to manage these, how to evaluate them. So I've presented at some of these like large organizations. I've been to some UN General Assembly meetings as a 23-year-old, because this is something that I'm really focused on and have some sort of motivation towards and expertise in. But so I especially with ESG, I would never be too worried about what background you come from, and people frequently value different backgrounds. So one of my connections, again, the person I was speaking about before, who's the head of responsible investment at a large asset manager, she came out of a history background. So bringing some sort of new perspective to the table when there's so many people already talking about ESG from the normal perspectives is always an interesting and good opportunity to have.
That's really neat. Thank you.
Well, when I got into ESG and responsible investment, I mean, nobody did have training in responsible investment. It didn't exist. Every single one of us was, I would say, a retread. We'd either come in like I did from a sustainability background. I've been working in sustainability in the diplomatic context, and then in various not-for-profit contexts. And I was working alongside people who their training was, capital markets, or they would, done the financial investment management training, and they were learning about sustainability. I think there are training courses now where you can learn about both of those things at the same time, but it just didn't exist. But that was great, actually. We learned a lot from each other. I think that's like bringing together people from different disciplines can create a lot of responsible for a lot of creativity and new ideas when those two perspectives clash together.
Yeah, I think that today it doesn't really matter what your background is. Sustainability is so pervasive and is really affecting every aspect of business and the economy, that you can leverage whatever background you have by enhancing your knowledge of sustainability. People can make career changes, early career, mid-career, much easier than in the past, I think, if you're moving towards a sustainability role. On Chris's comment quickly, we have one of the biggest biodiversity conferences ever coming up in Montreal next week, the COP15, the UN Biodiversity Conference.
Are you going?
Sorry.
Yeah, I'll be there. Yeah,
I'm hoping to go as well, so maybe I can see you.
Hope to see you there. There's a finance day on December 14th that's being organized by Finance Montréal.
Great, thank you. Sounds good.
There's another question in the chat. I don't think we addressed that, from Rosalind on Canada's ESG regulations.
Perfect. That gives an awesome opportunity. I'll read that out now. So Rosalind says, what is Canada's ESG regulation and enforcement looking like at the moment in comparison to Europe and the States? Also, if any panelists have insights on Asia, that would be great to know as well.
I can quickly answer that. Europe is, as the other two panelists have said, is by far a lot more advanced when it comes to disclosure requirements, and also the nature of those disclosure requirements. In North America, we focus on what we call single materiality, which is the impact of ESG issues on the business. In Europe, it goes both ways. You have to disclose the impact of ESG issues on your business, as well as your impact as a business on the planet, on society, which is a very controversial issue here in Canada and the US. Currently, disclosure requirements for Canada are pretty much non-existent for publicly listed companies. It's only for federally regulated institutions like banks and insurance companies that they will start. In the US, Chris mentioned the SEC has some proposals to require climate disclosure, which are quite ambitious. Actually, should they survive litigation, if they do come into force, I think that will be a major development and will certainly put pressure on Canada to go in that direction as well. In terms of Asia, I'm not an expert in Asia, but I know that there are disclosure requirements in some countries, but I won't venture to claim that I know exactly the details there.
One thing I'd like to add to that is I do think if there's an area that I would love to see Canada take a bit of a lead in, it would be in thinking about like what could or should disclosure requirements look like to discuss Indigenous reconciliation issues. I don't think we're not going to find that in the international standards. That's something that's really important for Canada, and that work's probably going to need to be done here.
I think that's a great point. ISSB is designed to be a baseline, and then hopefully every country would take that and customize it to its own needs. But I totally agree, right? I mean, especially with biodiversity and natural capital, the vast majority of which sits on indigenous lands. You can't really move forward on these issues without some kind of reconciliation with indigenous peoples.
Yeah, well, thank you. I was just really curious about that. So thanks for adding that.
So I guess this brings us to 8 o'clock, almost on the dot right now. In respect for everybody's time, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all our panelists, Amr, Michelle, and Chris. Thank you so much for taking your time. I'm confident this was our best event yet, and I really, really appreciate all your insights and this wonderful conversation that you brought us through today. For those that are new to ESG, or for those that maybe are watching this on YouTube down the line, I highly recommend subscribing to our newsletter, following us on Instagram, and liking us on LinkedIn to kind of stay up to date with all of our future events and our articles that are posted on a bi-weekly way. I'll just put the link to our newsletter in the chat right now for those that may not be subscribed. But in the meantime, thank you guys all so much for your time, and have a lovely, wonderful evening.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And if there's any follow-up questions, I'm assuming the panelists are all happy to kind of take any questions after time as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this event. I actually had a question. I was wondering if, aside from using ESG to prevent like backlash or to please conscious investors, do you think companies are starting to use ESG frameworks to actually mitigate risk, or if they're starting to sort of be concerned about climate change? I know, Chris, you had mentioned Ørsted, but I was wondering like if you have any examples in North America.
I think my colleagues have gone, haven't they?
Oh no.
Well, I can have a go at that question. I have a couple of minutes. Do you want me to?
Yeah, sure, for sure.
Sure. So the question again was, could you just repeat that?
Yeah, so do you think ESG frameworks are more being used to please conscious investors or prevent backlash, or if they're actually being used to mitigate climate change by companies as a sort of way to reduce risk?
Oh yes, I do think companies are thinking very seriously internally. Well, the sensible ones are anyway. Are thinking very seriously internally about climate risk, about the physical risks of climate change, and about how they are going to navigate the transition. Some of them are already very much up against this right now, and are working on kind of dedicated climate strategies for how they are going to navigate the transition. And again, I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's really about approaching ESG from the right end. If a company has sat down and seriously thought about different sustainability factors and identified the ones that it thinks impact it the most significantly, and if that's been discussed up at the board level and the directors and the senior management are aligned around a set of ESG factors that they think are really important for the health of the company, they will be very, very serious about focusing on those things. They're obliged to. It's their duty to address those issues once they've been identified. That's why it's really important for people to start at the right end, not to go straight to thinking about how can I make a nice ESG report, but really to start internally at the right end, thinking about what factors really, really matter for this company. If people do that, then and they've got the senior management, the board aligned around that, they will take action.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I was overrun. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
I guess we're down to the last few, but if there's no more questions, Michelle, thank you so much again.
You're
really
welcome.
Appreciate hearing from
I
you.
didn't want to leave that question hanging.
No, thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Have a great night.